Okay, let's get started. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to our SIPA webinar on Belt and Road Initiative in a post-COVID-19 era and outlook for the Indo Pacific, which will be presented by Dr. Xue Gong. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sook, and I'm the lecturer of economics at JCU Singapore, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Now, before we commence, I would like to first remind our audience of several housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded for publicity purposes. All attendees will be able to ask questions at any point of the webinar through the Q&A function, and the Q&A will be carried out at the end of the presentation. There will be a satisfaction poll and survey at the end of the webinar, and we would appreciate if you can take a moment to fill that out. And finally, if there's any technical issues, please use the chat button to communicate with our event organizers. So now, without further ado, it's an honor for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Xue Gong. Dr. Xue is the Assistant Professor in China Program of S. Rajaratnam School of International Study at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. She is an active researcher in the areas of international political economy, China's economic diplomacy, Asian regionalism, and governance. Her research has been published widely in top quality journals such as World Development, International Affairs, and Harvard Asia Quarterly, just to name a few. She has 2 co-edited books on Belt and Road Initiative. She has also contributed to several book chapters on China economic statecraft, China's corporate social responsibility, and Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia. Now, aside from these scholarly works, she has also written various op-ed articles in the South China Morning Post, the Diplomat, and so on. So once again, it's truly an honor to welcome Dr. Xue to share her expertise about Belt and Road Initiative with us. And over to you, Dr. Xue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dan, for a kind introduction. It is my great pleasure to be here. Before I start, I would like to thank Dr. Dan and her colleagues for inviting me to this CITBA webinar. I would like also to thank the audience for your interest and participation in this webinar. Hopefully, by the end of this webinar, you will find my presentation useful. Head up that I don't have any slides, so I'm going to just share with you on the talking points. So when Dr. Dan wrote to me discussing on the topic, we agreed to address 3 questions that are important, relevant, and up to date. So respectively, they are, first of all, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of any changes, shift in investment strategies during and after the COVID-19 period. And also, I would like to pose some scenarios in terms of challenges, opportunities to the countries in the region here in Southeast Asia. And the second question we agreed to sort out is how the MEGA FTA, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, is likely to impact China's BRI project. Last but not least is in terms of the changing geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape since the launching of the BRI, especially in terms of the US-China competition, what will the BRI be like in the framework of the emerging new regional order that is shaped by the concept of Indo Pacific. All right, so let's go back to the question one by one. On the first question, in terms of the changes in BRI, well, let me start with a very brief background introduction on the flagship foreign policy itself. It is BRI is an economic foreign policy introduced by Chinese government since 2013. So when it came out, almost 10 years, right? Many analysts and policymakers, they commonly, take BRI as the public goods that China could provide to the region and even the world, especially, at the background where you've seen retrenching United States, after the global financial crisis in 2008. Nonetheless, the BRI throughout the 10 years also witnessed increasing criticisms, doubts, and even pushbacks, by regional states here in Southeast Asia or in Europe or even in Latin America. So before COVID-19, the global health crisis struck the world, there actually have been considerable adjustments and changes in the Chinese government approach, especially in 2019, when the Chinese President Xi Jinping announced much greener, much linear and cleaner BRI during the BRI Summit for Cooperation. So the point I would like to highlight is that it becomes very clear, before the COVID-19, the Chinese government has toned down the hype of BRI, not just because of the pushbacks against it, but also because of China's significant overseas lending problems rising from the ground. So first of all is the increasing non-performing loans made. The Chinese policy banks, the major lender in the BRI, made those Chinese policy banks themselves reluctant to offer more loans to the BRI countries, because the majority of the projects, they're considered as time-consuming, and in terms of commercial viability, it is not sustainable. And second is, for the host countries, they have also been reluctant to increase their debt burdens in the wake of growing budget deficits. So a few participating countries, they've already demanded renegotiation of long terms with China, or bargain with China by inviting the economic competitors like Japan or even India. So these changes essentially explain that why there were almost no new infrastructure projects were approved prior to the pandemic. So there was kind of like a reflection period for the Chinese government to think about, hey, what should we do, with those, problems that we haven't really foreseen before. But the pandemic, in my mind, radically changed the progress and the development of those agreed and existing projects due to the travel bans, restrictions, and lockdowns. And this was very obvious, in 2020 and even during the half year of 2021, before the borders were pretty much relaxed in Southeast Asia. So, for instance, projects like Jakarta-Bandung Railway or China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, they were being disrupted, stalled due to the the suspension or slowing down, disruption of supplies or the shortages of Chinese workers. There was a data to show that in 2020, for the whole year, it was estimated that about 20% of projects under BRI have been seriously affected by the pandemic. And the data was from the Ministry of Commerce of the Chinese government. All right, so following that, in terms of the toning down of the scale and the hypes of the BRI, there was the other change of the direction, which is COVID-induced changes in the format of BRI, from large-scale physical infrastructure connectivity to health and digital connectivity. And in particular, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an enormous opportunity for Beijing to subtly shape the new rhetoric surrounding the BRI from 2020 to the end of 2021. So from mid-March to May of 2020, China was reported to send massive supplies and experts to train the local medical teams in Southeast Asia. And also you've seen that, like, the high level or more frequent high level of ministerial level of exchanges between foreign ministers from Southeast Asia and China to work on the regional health governance issues. So when settling down domestically around March and April, China fastened its pace in delivering relief packages and vaccines through those calculated public diplomacy operations. And right after that, you've seen China has attempted to, outsource the production of its vaccines, like like Sinopharm in the region. I give you instance which was launched this March, where when Myanmar had this first production of Myan-Cofam COVID-19 vaccine at Myanmar pharmaceutical industry in collaboration with China. So with that being said, that basically, I basically wanted to show you how the COVID-19 has shifted the restrictive infrastructure spending on those large-scale physical projects to the priorities, in the pharmaceutical area, but also the BRI dimension expanded to the digital area. For instance, the remote learning or remote medical consultation, e-commerce, or other contactless human activities. As China seeks to share its experiences of containing the COVID-19 pandemic with other countries, one key area of China's measure is to use the digital health system supported by the 5G telecommunication systems, as well as artificial intelligence technologies as part of its humanitarian assistance efforts overseas. And the third point I want to highlight here is that due to the persistent strict dynamic zero COVID policy and the resurgent outbreak of Omicron in China since April in Shanghai, it becomes very obvious that Beijing is now very much inward looking. The priority now is seen, to shifted to domestic public health issues. Although we can see sporadic foreign economic activities continue to remain, nonetheless, due to the strict border control, long and harsh quarantine requirements, restricted or very limited offline business activities, they are all expected to reduce China's, attention to be paid in the BRI. But the existing BRI projects are, as I said, they are much toned down, but they are still ongoing. Although I also noticed that these projects, they receive relatively less media coverage. So barely you can have an up-to-date information on what they look like now and how much progress they've made. And it's easy to understand. I mean, when the Chinese government decided to shift their focus for this time being, right? And on the other hand, the supply chain for these projects, the existing projects in the host country, they're also being affected in terms of shipping efficiency and in terms of, bringing the Chinese experts or managers on site assistance. But again, those existing projects, they will continue to be carried out. And they're subject to respective local COVID policies in the host country. So those above points for the first question, what are the changes in the BRI? So since I mentioned the supply chain, I would like to bring up the second question on RCEP, how the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP, is likely to impact BRI. First of all, I would like to highlight that China has been preparing for a global supply chain restructuring and they're trying to make use of BRI, as part of this facilitating process. And regional mega FTAs such as RCEP is believed, as part of this process as well, to mitigate the regional instability and disruptions, especially, nowadays caused by exogenous shocks like pandemic or great power rivalry and others. But from the beginning, the BRI, as I said, was designed to help the Chinese firms to occupy important global supply chain divisions of network and to strengthen its already rising position or dominant position in the global supply chain. And Southeast Asia has become one of the most important destinations for China in this regard. And you've seen, for the past decade, there were increasing investments, not just in infrastructure, but also in the overseas industrial parks, cross-border trade zones, or economic development zones funded by China, right? And according to the data provided by Ministry of Commerce as well, that almost 80% of Chinese-funded industrial parks are actually in Asia, with Southeast Asia being the top destination. So those are the, like the background information that the region has always been the interest for the Chinese government. So with the ratification, or with the signing and ratification of the mega FTA, RCEP is expected to assist in China in strengthening the increasingly vulnerable supply chain. In particular, it is believed to help China to break out the supply chain blockage, in particular on the sectors being harassed or sanctioned by the United States. And it will also help China to upgrade its own supply chain by helping moving China out of China. It will also help regulate China's BRI activities, facilitating Chinese companies to go out with more coherent, more harmonized rules in the region. It will also help strengthen the Chinese standards in products, in projects, as well as improve their market efficiency while reducing the cost of raw materials throughout the projects. And more importantly, the RCEP is believed to reduce and even eliminate the relevant non-tariff trade barriers. For instance, in the custom clearance, or in data governance, or in the phytosanitary or sanitary aspects. So I mean, the economists, they've been working out on defending or arguing how RCEP is going to help China. And also it is it's believed to be beneficial to the region as well. That explains why the countries or the 10 ASEAN member states, as well as the other 5 regional states, they agreed to sign the agreement, right? But in terms of geopolitical competition, RCEP is believed to reduce the stress and the influences posed by the like-minded resilient supply chain allies led by the United States, assisted by Japan, for instance, or it is believed to mitigate the risks and influence to be brought up by the Indo Pacific economic framework, which is still on the making. So overall, for the political or economic reasons, it is believed that China would benefit enormously from this mega FTA. But the expected benefits of the BRI from RCEP is not without challenges. And as a matter of fact, the changing geoeconomic and geopolitical landscape, especially in the context of increasing tensions between China and the US, has posed great uncertainty to the region with regards to cooperation, stability, and even peace. On the one hand, China is believed, to continue with the economic engagement with the region and even with the United States, but you can see a very clear inclination towards Southeast Asia. Especially for the past few years, where we've seen China try to hedge against the risks of supply chain disruptions caused by those geopolitics, and Chinese firms are seeking to reshore their business and build, their capacity in Southeast Asia. And in terms of trade, China also Southeast Asia or ASEAN member states also become the top, trade partner in replace of United States and EU, which is very astonishing, because for the past decades, the US or the EU has been the top 2 trading partners for China, but now it's Southeast Asia. And on the other hand, due to the exogenous shocks posed by the US harassment attacks, China is also preparing for an incremental detachment from certain markets, especially the markets that they are being targeted by the United States, like the tech, the high-tech areas, or in the areas where China considered as national security sensitive. For instance, data-related business. And also, Beijing shifted or is seen to shift its BRI resource allocation more towards internal consumption, very much inward-looking dual circulation model. And it is very obvious, in the outbreak of COVID in China, that the dynamic zero tolerance COVID policy mandate, has very much restricted the Chinese exporters from looking outward, but instead they are trying to find the market internally, right? And one more thing about this outbreak of COVID China is due to the dynamic zero tolerance policy, it was made mandate throughout the whole country, and there's already data showing the manufacturing, logistics or exporting or other service activities that are being slowed down, and the data doesn't look really good for the Chinese economic performance. And with that being said, Beijing's efforts in terms of reshaping a narrative favorable to its image through this COVID tolerance policy also backfires at home, especially in Shanghai, since April of this year. For the past 2 years since the pandemic broke out, Beijing has been caught between public spending on domestic economic recovery and financial subsidies to the BRI. Nowadays, this conundrum posed to the Chinese government is believed that you will see much more reduced investments in BRI, especially in those smaller and less critical overseas markets. And last but not least, I would like to highlight that the conflicting ideas of China's economic governance, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, is gradually changing the notion of connectivity. You start to hear the words about self-reliance, dual circulation as early as 2019, and it was proliferated and even framed officially by the Chinese government in 2011, where China is believed to create a bifurcated world. All right, and that essentially means the connectivity idea behind the BRI is being challenged by not just the geopolitics posed by geopolitical competition posed by the US, but also by China itself. And we are starting to see this bifurcated world on the making, and this world is represented, for instance, in this one coronavirus, two systems, scenario. And this one coronavirus, two systems scenario are happening in the region, with China, probably China being the only one, insistent on the zero tolerance policy, and assisted by its tightening, electronic surveillance used for the pandemic. And now China is even more domestically oriented because of the Black Swan breakout in Shanghai, and as well as Beijing. So it becomes very understandable that the Chinese government would be very likely to substantially cut off the budgets that were supposed to be allocated to its foreign economic policies. And as a matter of fact, if you are talking about, the slowing down of outreach or official outreach by the Chinese government, it's very clear, Beijing has restricted many track 1, track 0.1 or track 2 activities that were supposed to be put into place during normal times. For instance, the Chinese embassies are more preoccupied with COVID prevention and restriction measures for the Chinese citizens overseas than normal diplomatic or consulate work. And the scale of the Chinese charm offensive through economic engagement and public diplomacy is also ostensibly shrinking. If you compare, the foreign, if you compare the state in terms of state visit or the leader visit from China to a region to what the United States has been doing, it's very obvious that China has been relying on much more remote, outreach engagement rather than this face-to-face engagement. And this actually in diplomacy is very, very important, to facilitate or forge or improve or even strengthen the relationship, in terms of interpersonal level. So with all those being said, my conclusion for the prospect of Indo Pacific political economy is that in the short term, China's great ambition in pushing for the BRI is very much dependent on how they will handle the domestic breakout of a pandemic and Xi Jinping's political prospect in China. For now, it looks like for this time being, China, it looks like Beijing is the one, binding its own feet and hand in both domestic and foreign policy activities due to the contrasting ideas on the governance. On the one hand, Beijing speaks highly of opening up, and you can see the visits to Hainan, in terms of the high quality of foreign trade zones, of high level of quality economic reforms. But on the other hand, you've seen a very contrasting picture in terms of the strict, COVID dynamic tolerance policy, and also those slowing down and even, zero engagement in certain level of business. But again, no matter, how the domestic situation changes, I would believe Southeast Asia will still remain the popular destination for China's foreign policy due to the strategic importance of the region. So despite slowing down the infrastructure projects, I will not be surprised that China will continue to invest economic, political, or diplomatic resources in the region, although in a different shape and a different format. I think I shall stop here and we can talk more during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay. So I will take over now. All right. Thank you very much for your fantastic presentation, Dr. Xue. I think this is really a timely topic, given that the pandemic is still casting shadow on the global economic outlook, including the economic outlook within China, as you just mentioned. And China, as the world's second largest economy, its strategies in Belt and Road Initiative, and also its countermeasures against this U.S. attempts to revive its influence in the region, would certainly play a crucial role in shaping the Indo Pacific region's economic recovery in a post-pandemic period. So I'm really grateful to learn a lot from you during the past half an hour time. So I think now it's time for the exciting Q&A session, and I can already see some great questions raised by our audience in the Q&A. So far, there are 2 questions. But before addressing those questions, I have my own question for you. You have mentioned that because of this dynamic zero COVID-19, this outbreak of COVID-19 in China, China has become more invert looking now. So, while we also see the US try to scale up its presence in the Indo Pacific region through establishing, let's say, the Blue Dot Network and also the new Indo Pacific Economic Framework. So, do you see China is losing ground, in establishing its influence in the Indo Pacific region? So, what is your thought about this?
Right. Thanks very much for this wonderful question. Actually, this is the question, that we're being asked like almost every day. We received the US delegates even yesterday. So they will ask about, given the situation that China is very much retrenched in terms of, economic outreach. So what the US should do, to increase the influence. When we were being asked this question, the first counter question we were asked back is, if you are really, genuinely interested in the region, why don't you sign an FTA with us? So this is the question always struck the policymakers in the United States, that on the one hand, the domestic trade politics, prevents the policymakers from making further commitment, either through the regional FTA or mega FTA. And on the other hand, I think it really comes to the question of who is going to take the leadership in those FTAs, even if the US, retreat their indifference to CPTPP, for instance, or TPP, for instance. I would not be surprised that Southeast Asia may be really reluctant to sign that kind of level of FTA, because there's something that many of the Southeast Asian states, they cannot afford. For instance, in terms of IPR protection, intellectual property, rights protection, that is being perceived as very disadvantageous to developing countries. But for China, it has been very skillfully using the networks, connections, and very flexible negotiation skills to sign a contract first, and then they discuss or they negotiate more in details in terms of implementation. So this is the very prominent area where the US is still believed to be lagging behind China in terms of forging those institutional commitment. That's one thing. And the second thing is, with all these proposals like Indo Pacific Economic Framework or even Blue Dot Network, the region is very much cautious. First thing is, what are you going to offer us? The US is famous for losing interest in building the large-scale projects like providing electricity, power, or those tangible projects that the local politicians, they can use they can use to strengthen their political legitimacy. What the US is interested in is public health, for instance, or human rights related governance issues that that could be controversial in the region, right? So that's one thing. And the second thing is, those proposals that you mentioned, they are very much value and democracy based, if not alliance, at least some ideological considerations behind. So again, to what extent the region is interested in having those elements in economic cooperation, it's very obvious to see. So to sum up your question, at this point, China still has the advantages because of the ways that it can assure Southeast Asia. It makes Southeast Asia comfortable in terms of subtly or rhetorically playing the card of portraying Southeast Asia as the leader. Although, some people may not agree because, like China's aggressiveness in South China Sea, et cetera, but at least on the economy front, China has been very successful, efficient in terms of portraying it as a public provider.
Yeah, thanks for answering my question, Dr. Xue. I think there's actually another question which is linked to that Blue Dot Network and the US-China relation. Do you think now this US-China competition in foreign trade and investment has become a zero-sum game now? And I think as your answer implied, then the Blue Dot Network is actually not a perfect alternative to the BRI for the peripheral countries in the region, right?
Well, first thing first about the Blue Dot Network. The concept, the idea has been out for a few years, but it's very abstract. There were some governance ideas behind it in terms of transparency, in terms of minimizing or eliminating the data, or the business secret in the data transfer, etc., etc. But you don't really see concrete projects being established here. If you want to have those network, you got to have the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure being built. But who is strong at this? It is obviously not the United States. The US has much less state capacity to mobilize or to tell the companies where you should invest, right? But only countries, the state capitalism, led countries like China, they could do that. And that's one thing. And the second thing is, I don't really perceive it as a zero-sum game, just my personal perspective, because the MNCs, for instance, from the US, from EU, or from China, from Japan, they all rely on the solid and sound infrastructure, on the ground to facilitate their business. And actually, China or the Western allies, they could cooperate in this regard, but unfortunately, the geopolitics has outweighed, the idea of economic cooperation. So with the framing or the meme proliferated by the media, by the mindset of the political leaders from both of the countries, US and China, I think it is being portrayed as a zero-sum game. As the zero-sum game now. So I think it's the time for Southeast Asia, especially for ASEAN leaders to strengthen, their leadership, their centrality in terms of reducing the frictions or these unhealthy, competition policies. Unfortunately, we don't really see much yet from ASEAN side. I mean, ASEAN is even caught up by what happened in Myanmar, right? So it's a very worrying future. So what you suggest could be true, but it really depends on the conditions, whether ASEAN is able to stand up again, like in the 1990s, where it is being in the driver's seat in forging the multilateralism to control or to maintain the stability in the region. And second, whether there's a turning back point of Chinese foreign policy from being more aggressive to more accommodative, or it depends on the US-China policy, whether it will just accept the fact that China is a rising power and it has to accommodate China's rise.
I think following on that questions, we have one interesting question from our audience, Professor May. In your views, what are the implications of the IPEF, the Indo Pacific Economic Framework, on China, ASEAN, or China and Singapore relations?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's difficult to answer because the Indo Pacific Economic Framework is also very abstract at this point, and it contains the elements that are able to be or that they're not really answering to the demands of the local economies. As I said before, in terms of to what extent those Indo-Pacific allies, especially the Western countries, they could provide the resources to support the locally needed infrastructure. Who are going to build those hydropower, and to what extent the standards being customized to the local needs, and who are going to fund this, right? And the second thing in terms of this is this economic framework, to what extent it is facilitate the trade issues, to what extent it will help the ASEAN member states, in terms of fostering or promoting their export-oriented industries. So it has been very unclear, and again, as I said, it is still being on the negotiation and on the making. But there are some prominent areas where the bilateral economy relations, for instance, between the US and Singapore, those in those areas that could actually set the stone for the future of cooperation. But I'm really doubt that if the US is keen on the multilateralism, even under Biden administration, because you would see his foreign economic policy is very much constrained by the Congress and by the Republicans in terms of whether they should revive the topic of trade, or whether they should loosen the trade negotiation in the contentious areas like IPR protection, like environmental protection, like labor rights, etc., etc. So for the geostrategists, they would perceive this really much more into the political purpose rather than the economic purpose. So my answer to this is it really remains to be seen. If IPEF gives the region a very clear idea that it will be interested in trade, in multilateralism, I think the region will be very much welcoming the IPEF. Otherwise, I would see the region will be wait and see.
I think the reason why our audience may have these questions is because Singapore has known to have this balanced diplomatic approach, right, between the US and China. So one of our audience asked, so it seems that with this intensifying US and China tension, are smaller countries in the region now facing increasing pressure to pick sides between the US and China? And what is this implication of this on the Singapore balanced diplomatic approach?
Well, this question has been asked, yes, has been asked not just to the scholars, but also to the political leaders. And I think Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has addressed this in different occasions, and the answer is very obvious. But as far as I know, as far as I can observe or I can understand, actually neither of the two great powers, explicitly pressurized the region to pick sides. But the unexpected consequences of the great power rivalry is that they may have to choose sides. So this is not really like, how to say, this. We've already seen, first of all, we've already seen even before the great power rivalry, being intensified, even before Donald Trump came to power, we've already seen the titillating, behavior such as Cambodia towards China, and we've also seen countries in the region, they have been very much caught up in a rising China, in the contentious South China Sea issue, for instance. So I would rather to address this question as how the middle or small powers in the region deal with the great powers, not necessarily in a scenario of the two great powers competition. The Southeast Asian countries, they used to be very, skillful and also very influential in terms of forging the multilateral platform to maintain the stability, to reduce the uncertainty. But nowadays, the two great powers, they're kind of like sidelined the region here, although rhetorically they speak highly of the centrality and they respect the neutrality of this region. So what I can think of is, I think the regional states, due to their own domestic or political concerns or considerations, I can still see relatively neutral and balanced diplomacy, which still serve their national interests. But if you, I mean, this question really depends on which issue you are looking at, right? If you're looking at cross-strait Taiwan issue, and you would ask whether Southeast Asian countries would be like, Western European countries, they would impose sanctions on Russia, and would they do the same on China? I would say perhaps no, right? And this has much less to do with the balance of diplomacy, but much more to do how they perceive China in specific issues. But if it comes to the issues like South China Sea, we've seen both sides, the China and Southeast Asia, they've been tackling this issue relatively, less confrontational, and that is the norm, and of the region. But again, this is a evolving question, that I feel very challenging to address, and yeah, I think I should stop here.
Yeah, I think seems like so far much focus of the discussion has been placed on like US-China geopolitical and geoeconomic tension. So maybe let's shift our focus back on the BRI itself. Now, one question from Associate Professor Jacob Wood. Some critic, I think you have also mentioned this, some critics of the BRI have actually excused China of pursuing a form like of debt trap diplomacy. So to what extent you actually think such assertion is true? And I think you have mentioned how like the step China has taken so far to this kind of to turning this kind of negative narrative. Would you want to also elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first thing is I would like to draw the research from Professor Deborah Broadcom from Johns Hopkins University. She is a China scholar working extensively on China's loans in Africa. And she's the one that, trying to unpack the myth of debt trap diplomacy. I mean, if you're interested, you can, the audience can always go back to read her work. But her findings are the debt trap diplomacy is actually a purposely, articulated and manipulated agenda that started from New Delhi, and then it was proliferated in the White House or in the Pentagon, by the former secretary. All right, so it is a political, project that is trying to reduce China's influence. So that is the kind of like her background information, but her research also disclosed that there are really some debt issues, and those debt issues are mainly because of the unhealthy, economic policy planning by the host country, also, exacerbated by the Chinese businesses, how to say, the Chinese businesses miscalculation of the risks of investing there. So there was like two sides of stories that contributed to the debt issue. Although her research also found out, the debt issue is very much less prevalent. Most of the projects, they're still sustainable, and they indeed contributed to the local employability, the local economy. But we cannot deny the fact that, with the rise of Chinese lending capacity, if the local agencies, no matter from China or from the local or from the host governments, it will unexpectedly lead to the problem, right? So that is her research. What I want to contribute here to this question is the debt trap diplomacy can also apply to the borrower countries that purposely set up the debt or purposely set up the trap, not that set up the trap to the Chinese government. Usually, if you are doing the research on China, usually those businesses, they're still led. Those Chinese representatives, most of them, they're SOE managers, and they usually accompany their Chinese leaders in those state-backed projects. They sometimes may just take over the projects without much time or resources to consider whether it's doable or not, and because they're supported by the policy banks. So, for the local governments, for the host countries, to strengthen their legitimacy, to improve on their economic performance, they may coax the Chinese government into those projects. So my point here is the trap can also be set by the host country, but eventually, the debt health issue should be fixed both at bilateral level as well as multilateral level, where the standards, for instance, from OECD or from the World Bank or from even AIIB could contribute to this. And I can see, China could actually work together with those multilateral platforms to improve those debt issue areas, for the sustainable reasons.
Yeah, I certainly agree that it's actually a mutual responsibility, not just the responsibility of China, but also of the host economy to make sure that this project is sustainable. Now, so I think this one actually leads to another question asked by our audience. What are the concrete roles and responsibility the host countries, the government should take in order to maximize gain from the Belt and Road Initiative and also thrive in the current US-China conflicts?
That's a very broad question, and that's the area where, many of the lenders from developed countries or from the private sectors, that they are unable to work because, so the ultimate issue here is the governance capacity for the local economies. There must be a reason why there's not much high quality of investments, right? Because of issues like corruption, red tapes, or even the conflicts, right? Or the or the political violence, etc., etc. So so the local economies, if they are unable to give the market confidence to the foreign investors, it will be very difficult to rely on the FDI providers to improve on the governance situation on the ground. So yeah, this is a very long-standing problem, and for the past few decades, it is controversial. It is debatable that to what extent the conditions imposed on the local economies really are conducive to their governance, capacity improvement, right? There are yes and no, answers to them. But again, I think a healthy economic development really requires the local governments to seriously take the reforms into their consideration in order to attract the diversity of FDIs.
So I think in your speech, you have also mentioned that China has now softened its approach to the BRI by taking a stronger environmental focus and also try to increase the quality of the infrastructure project. But do you think such measures have helped to foster greater level of trust with its partner in the Indo Pacific region, especially if we still see this kind of geopolitical dispute such as South China Sea issue in the region?
So the question actually wants to say that the image building on the ground will facilitate or will reduce the geopolitical contention. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first thing first is China is learning, right? It's on the learning curve in terms of incorporating the advanced standards of corporate social responsibility, for instance, and in terms of emulating certain levels of OECD practices. But such research on to what extent China really is ahead of itself compared to few years back is still missing. So the picture here is very fragmented. You've seen China's improvements in the areas, for instance, in the renewables, for instance, in some of the projects that in some of the countries that have much you know, higher standard of governance, or even in Myanmar, you know, during the before the military coup, the Chinese businesses, they improved their images and corporate social responsibility activities there. But it looks to me it's very ad hoc. Why I say that? First of all, I do not deny, you know, the Chinese state regulations or directives have improved a lot and also increased the mandates into their overseas operation or implementation of those projects. But the Chinese businesses, they are very much constrained, you know, by the norms that they shouldn't work beyond what the local requirements require, local governments require. And one constraining factor is they are concerned whether, you know, their outreach activities in improving on the corporate governance may violate the non-interference principle, especially in the areas like working with the labor unions, you know, or conducting, you know, due diligence in terms of forced forced land reclamation or acquisition. So their business pattern is very constrained by what is being, you know, conditioned domestically, right? And that basically is what I try to say. What I try to say is they have the intention, they actually have the capacity, but they are unable to override the general framework that's being underpinned by its Chinese foreign economy policy. So it will be dismayed to see, you know, such outstanding or such significant improvements will be carried out by the Chinese businesses.
We also have one question related to the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. I think this is also, you know, a good time to make these questions, because this year actually marks the halfway point for the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So for those who do not know, it's actually a global development framework adopted by all United Nations members that pledge to achieve economic development that is socially inclusive and environmental sustainable by the year 2030. So the questions is, China has made commitment that it will shoulder the responsibility of implementing the 2030 Development Agenda. So whether this commitment has been embedded in the BRI projects, and what kind of efforts China have made to align its BRI project with the Sustainable Development Goals?
Sure. Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the Chinese government has been branding the BRI, you know, as contributing to the sustainable development, and you also see it has successfully incorporated the BRI into the UN General Assembly, you know, in some of the resolutions, right? I wanted to highlight in the areas, first of all, is the climate change, where the Chinese government provided the year marked 8 in the United Nations Environment Protection. I couldn't remember the exact amount, but it is believed, you know, to help the third world countries to improve on their environmental performance, you know, throughout the industrialization activities. So that's one area. And the second area is the BRI in terms of, you know, the poverty reduction. I think China tries to use it or tries to link the BRI, you know, to help with the projects that could export experiences of poverty elimination and reduction projects overseas. You may be wondering, you know, to what extent it's really related to BRI. To be honest, I don't know either, but it's being branded, you know, as part of some public goods that the Chinese governments can provide. So the two areas I wanted to highlight, and it has been relatively efficient and successful, especially, for instance, in the Mekong countries, the Mekong region in mainland Southeast Asia, where you've seen, the Chinese local governments, they're being either requested or ordered to provide different, hands-on as well as hands-off expertise and knowledges to Cambodia, to Myanmar, in terms of how to use the biotech to increase the crops productivity, things like that. So if given chance, and if China is still able to provide such resources, I think it is really a good thing for the world development.
Yep. Okay, so, sorry, because of the time constraint, we cannot take all the questions. So maybe would you mind taking the last question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I think one question from Dr. Tiru. Why isn't China co-opting and co-creating value with regional countries of the BRI? Why is it not promoting the Silk Road as a past connect to the future and share heritage to build on? Oh, yeah, and where is the shared dream as the Silk Road does not only start in China, but it was once a two-way trade and exchange? So this will be the last question for today.
Okay, first of all, I'm not sure about the history of the BI. I know roughly I know about it, but I guess this question may be pertinent to the one that I guess Prof. Turo Mara wants to highlight, that BI is very much like China-centered, unilateral economic project. I would agree with you, in terms of the format. And although China has been, rhetorically claiming it welcomes anyone, regardless of the political system, regardless of the ideology, it is an open concept. But in reality, you've seen a very much China-centered approach where, China is the one who funds, China is the one who, exports or sends its expertise. But I would also like to highlight this returning to the local ownership, especially after 2019, when the Chinese government realized, this unilateral or China-centered approach is not really sustainable. And as a matter of fact, it encounters the pushbacks, right? So you've seen on some of the projects itself, it is actually listening to the local governments, what it wants to propose, and it tries to reduce the burdens, especially the image burdens, caused by the local governance issues. And the examples are abundant in the Mekong regions, where the Chinese companies or the Chinese local governments, they provided they only provided like expertise and certain amount of money, subject to the progress and development of the projects, and subject to the due diligence of the projects. And the beneficiary of those projects are actually small and medium enterprises, local small medium enterprises. So that basically means in terms of local procurement, in terms of local supplies, it is much more guaranteed than before, where the Chinese ones are dominating. But again, I'm not speaking that all of the projects are being like that, but there's some change.
Thank you very much for addressing all those challenging questions, Dr. Xue. I think we have now reached the end of this webinar, and I'm sure our audience will agree with me that this has been a truly, enlightening session. And thank you very much. And before you leave, you should be able to see a satisfaction poll on your screen. So I would appreciate if you can take time to fill that out. And once again, a big thank you to all our audience and to Dr. Xue, and may you all have a good evening.
Thank you, Dr. Dan and your team. And thanks everyone for attending the webinar.
Yeah, thanks.